My name is Jennifer Gray Thompson, and I am the CEO of After the Fire. Welcome to the podcast, How to Disaster: Recover, Rebuild, and Reimagine. In this podcast, we bring you the very best practices, best hearts, and great ideas from other disaster-affected communities. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the How to Disaster podcast, where we help you recover, rebuild, and reimagine. My name is Jennifer Gray Thompson, and I am the CEO of After the Fire USA, a nonprofit that helps communities navigate after major disasters, and we specialize in wildfire. Today's guest is Kate Bulger, and I've actually wanted to have Kate on for a few years. I've known about her work through Fannie Mae. I love Project Porchlight. This is very much about financial well-being and education, in particular after a disaster. You know, Kate's skill set here is something that's desperately needed. There's a huge gap in the market to actually help people navigate after a disaster. Financial well-being is one of the things that everybody encounters as a huge barrier to rebuilding. It's an equity issue. And I love the fact that not only is Kate a person who helped conceive of Project Porchlight as part of Money Management International, but she did this after meeting disaster victims in Joplin, Missouri. And she saw, when she stayed in contact with them for years after, that there is a very long slog to recovery. A lot of people think of disaster in just the first 6 to 8 weeks, and, you know, when it's on television and we're thinking about it. But for those of us who work in it, we actually know that the hardest times come in year 2, 3, 4, and 5, when nobody's paying attention anymore. And your only way forward is really, you know, by yourself. There aren't a lot of resources for you. But in the case of Project Porchlight, they'll actually stay with you for at least 18 months. And, you know, I feel very confident whenever I recommend them to a newly fire-affected community. I'm really happy to have Kate on today, and I think you're going to enjoy her a lot. Once again, thank you for joining us on the How to Disaster podcast. We appreciate spending this time with you. Once again, welcome to the podcast, Kate. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So, you know, I've known about you for several years through my work with Fannie Mae and your work with Fannie Mae. But what I'm hoping to do first is really introduce you as a person in this space. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey into the disaster world?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Kate Bulger. I'm the Vice President of Business Development at Money Management International, and we're a nonprofit housing and financial counseling organization. You know, as an organization, we really came into this space out of just pure necessity. Our headquarters was in Houston, and in 2017, we were impacted by Hurricane Harvey. And so we had our own employees who were really struggling with recovering, struggling with understanding the process of applying for assistance and the roles of all of the different organizations that are part of recovery. We had people from the community coming to us, you know, asking for that same kind of help. And at the same time, we realized we were working with a lot of people in the rest of our work, where when we said, kind of, how did your financial hardship start? Their answer was, I was trying to recover from such and such a disaster, and I made a mistake, or something didn't go the way I planned, or I'm still trying to recover, and it's many, many years later. So we essentially took all of the different parts of our work that we do with all those different groups and put them together. And I have to say, I'm also really proud that Project Porchlight really started with people who were either in the middle of recovering from a disaster, for folks who were impacted by Harvey, but also from our employees and resources that we have who had recovered before. And so, for instance, the counseling manager who oversaw, or director who oversaw the team that does this work, she had recovered from 2 separate hurricanes in 2 different states, and was able to come and say, you know, I made this mistake. I fell for this scam. Like, here's the things I wish I knew. And so that's really how we got into it, was, again, just kind of pure necessity.
So yeah, I love that. And also, though, can you tell us just a little bit about how you personally came to find, you know, most of us come through this work, be either experiencing a disaster or being thereafter or something like that. So how did you actually personally come into this work, if you don't mind telling us just a little bit?
Sure. So my in-laws live in southern Missouri, not far from Joplin. At the time, they were nurses. They worked in a hospital setting. One of them was an emergency room nurse. And so when a huge tornado came through the city of Joplin, Missouri, their hospital was helping take care of people. And in going to visit them later, I got to know some of the folks who had been through the tornado. We drove through the town and really saw the aftermath. And I was really struck because every time we would go back to visit, every time I'd be talking with these folks, there was sort of this moment of like, oh, they're still recovering. It's been 2 years and they still don't have, the things that they had, the structure in the town, and the jobs hadn't come back. Like, they were still working to recover, even though there was a huge amount of resources that came into the area after the disaster. It was really just striking how long it took. And at that point, disaster was sort of waiting to find a way that we could help.
Yeah, it kind of embeds itself in people. And, once you see that basic human need, and when you see that there's something that you can actually do to lessen the suffering, for me, it's so much about like, it actually shows you that humanity is in full force, no matter what we're told, or people try to sell us the idea that we are all at odds. But if you experience a disaster, all of a sudden you realize we're not. So,
yeah.
Well, I love that. So thank you for doing that. And Joplin is such a great example. Like, they actually recovered faster than a lot of places. And they are a great example for other disaster areas in the sense that they decided to go fast. They were like, the first thing we need to do is get our schools back. I remember reading a superintendent's newsletter right after our disaster, because I was literally looking for resources on how to disaster. And one of the things they were talking about was their sort of call to arms, their call to action, and the whole town got together to rebuild the school first. And they got it done in like something like 3 months, something crazy like that. And it really was so important. Yeah. So, okay, great. Well, let's talk about specifically Project Porchlight. That's my favorite part of MMI. So we're going to go there. We're also going to link below so people will have access to find out about you, your LinkedIn profile, to find out about MMI, to find out about Project Porchlight. And Project Porchlight is part of Fannie Mae's Disaster Response Network. So you can always go there too to find out. So talk to us about, what do you offer disaster survivors? And then we're going to talk about the particular problems that they run into. But so what happens? I'm a victim of a disaster and I call you, and what can you help me with?
Yeah, absolutely. So our role is to help with the financial piece of the recovery. So folks will call us for a variety of reasons in their recovery. But what we're going to do is immediately assign them a counselor. And it's usually the very first person they talk to. And so that counselor is going to stick with them throughout their recovery. In that first interaction, we're going to really do kind of an assessment, kind of take your temperature of where you are, kind of what are your most important needs, what are your goals in particular, and what are the things that you've done, what are the things that you've tried, and have they worked or haven't they worked? And at the end of that session, it's usually about an hour long to get through it, sometimes longer. But at the end of that session, what we're going to have is a really clear couple of next steps for your financial recovery. So it might be applying for some type of aid. It might be getting a copy of your birth certificate. Like, there's all kinds of things that it can be. But the real challenge that we're solving there is, after a disaster, it is genuinely mind-boggling how many different things are pulling at someone's attention as they're trying to recover, right? There is so much more that needs their attention than they have attention to give. And so what our counselors are doing is really saying, like, okay, of the 10 million things you could give that attention to, let's narrow it down to just like the 3 or maybe 4 things that are absolutely most critical and that are going to move you forward to the next thing you need. And then we're going to figure out, like, here's how you get to that thing. And so at the end, they're going to have sort of these next couple of steps they're going to take, and they're going to agree on kind of what timetable we think those steps can happen on, right? And so, like, for instance, if they're saying, you need to call your credit card company and let them know that you've been the victim of a disaster, right? That's a really important piece in financial recovery. And, the consumer might say like, okay, I can do that Monday. And counselor's going to say, great, I'm going to call you again on Tuesday. And so on Tuesday, that counselor, same counselor, right, that's assigned to them, is going to say, okay, how did it go? Like, did it go well? Did they say anything? Like, what happened with that step? And if something happened and got in the way and that step didn't occur, right, we're going to do one of three things. So we're either going to kind of reset and figure out a way to get around that challenge to get that step done. Or if it's kind of a blocker, right, like they tried it and it just really didn't work, we're going to find a new step that someone can take to get to whatever kind of endpoint we're working for that particular action item. Or we're going to help the consumer do it together. So if calling their creditor, their bank is the step, then they're going to say like, okay, let's call the bank together right now. Like, let's get that done and get it off your plate. And you won't have to think about it or stress about it anymore. And then we're going to set a new next step. And when the next steps go well, I think this is important too. When that next step goes well, it can be really hard to find moments of kind of a win, right, in recovering, because there's so many losses. Like it's an overwhelming number of losses. And so having a counselor there who can kind of take a moment and cheerlead you, right, and applaud you for what you've done, no matter how big or small that step is, like every step forward is like a moment of celebration and is worth it. And so having that counselor be there to sort of mark that win with you helps people stay motivated in their recovery. And so that...
I just want to note that one of the reasons why that's so important for anybody who hasn't undergone a disaster or experienced it or worked with people after a disaster, if you're just listening to this podcast because you're curious, one of the things that we do is that it's trauma informed. Like, that's the deal, is that there's a certain amount of capacity that they have to deal with, because everything that they thought was true about their world, except for maybe their relationships, but like their physical surroundings, how they relate to nature, all of those things is upended. And it leaves people absolutely stunned. That's why we're called after the fire, because people aren't like after the fires. They're not thinking about all the fires. They're thinking about the one major disaster, and the rest of their life is a matter of before and after. And so I like the fact that you guys will sit on the line with them while they do it and handhold them. And I don't want people to overlook how important that is. And no matter who you are, how much money you have or don't have, that amount of compassionate handholding for something really complicated and important is hugely valuable. So I love that.
Thank you. Frankly, I love it too. And I think one of the challenges that's part of that trauma really shows its face is when folks are coming up on sort of the bureaucratic barriers of recovery. So, when you're asked to fill out a form for what will feel like 10,000th time, right? Or when you're asked to provide, income information, you provide it and they come back and say, no, but we need income information. And it doesn't seem like they're asking the question in a different way, right? Like, you feel like you gave it to them. Those are especially difficult, in part because your attention's everywhere, right? But also in large part because all of the things that helped you be organized before and kind of buttressed your ability to work through bureaucratic processes before is gone, right? And so yeah. I think our counselors are really good at helping people through those steps and helping people make progress.
Yeah. And people are starting, from the beginning in many ways. And one of the things that is different in wildfire, this can absolutely be true in wind and rain events, but in wildfire is that like everything is gone. Like your car can be gone. It's all just ashes, and it's gone in like 3 minutes and it's just done. But then the fire could still be going on for 3 months. It's a very strange way to experience disaster that is not as common except for tornadoes that take out everything, I understand, but it is a huge challenge in mega fires in particular. So do you help them navigate things like FEMA and SBA? How does that come into play?
Yeah, absolutely. So people can contact us at and work with Project Porchlight at any point in their recovery. Mm-hmm. But absolutely, we love to work with folks early on when there's still a ton of active aid in the area. And so we'll help folks work through their FEMA applications. Those can be complicated, can be difficult to understand. We'll also help folks if they get a denial letter from FEMA and they're
Which
not.
happens more often than not. So that's very
Yeah.
important. And people are in trauma. And once the federal government says to them no, then it doesn't occur to most of them that the absolute next step is always to appeal, and sometimes appeal again, and sometimes appeal again. So go ahead. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. And those appeals are, it's heart-wrenching to talk to someone who really, they need that money. And that's genuinely the only way they're going to be able to get through the next month or two, or through the next, thing that they critically need for their recovery. And they get that denial letter. And what we see a lot is those denial letters are not straightforward, right? So it could be that FEMA just needs like a clearer picture of your driver's license, for instance, right? And instead, you're going to get this really complex letter that it kind of bottom line just says, no, you can't have it. And so helping people kind of decode some of that language to make it clear what their next step is, like why they were denied, and just motivating people to get through that appeals process is, I think, a huge win. But absolutely, I think if there's one of the things that I was most shocked about as I came into kind of this space is how frequently people are denied for FEMA, denied for SBA, and how long it takes folks to get through the insurance process. Like those three things I was just massively not prepared for as I learned about this process. It was very eye-opening.
And no one is, though. Like nobody walks into the disaster space thinking, well, naturally, I'm going to be turned down. It's like being turned down for a loan, like for a house loan. You don't think, well, I just need to ask again. Like that doesn't happen. People don't do that. But in this case, 80% of the people who apply for SBA are denied. SBA is a loan program. You still have to have good credit in order to be able to get that loan. And, I know that they're working on some major transformations there, and I appreciate it to make it a little more humane, because they are great at getting into disaster right in that moment and saying, here we are, we're here for you. But the follow-up past that can just be very rough. And I don't think it's that SBA people are bad or they have bad intentions. It's just that the system is set up, all of it, FEMA, even HUD, all of it is set up to prevent fraud and public funds being misused. Fraud is rampant in this business. Can you talk to us about some of the things that your clients encounter in the space of fraud when they're coming up to, after a disaster?
Yeah, absolutely. So fraud and scams in particular are a real danger, and it can be really hard to spot. So our counselors are specially trained to listen for them, and also to provide education about what kind of scams people should be keeping an eye out for. So I think the one that I find kind of is very consistent across all disasters are contractor scams.
Yeah.
So it's things like contractors in many states, contractors cannot charge money to provide kind of that initial estimate, right? For them to go out and look and give an estimate, it has to be free. And we see all the time in those states, contractors charging money for that. We see a lot of materials, like rebuild material scams, where you'll have a contractor, they seem great, you sign the contract, they go to get the materials are delivered to your home. There was money in that contract that you believed was going to pay for those materials, but then a couple months later, there's a lien on your home because you didn't pay the material provider for those materials. And instead, the contractor just kept the money because the contract was worded in such a kind of a sneaky way. Can you
even go a little bit more deeply into that for people who don't know about how easy it is to put a lien on somebody's home? Because we see this, like, in our rebuild here in Sonoma County, this was a major weapon. We had some great contractors who really did heroic work, and then we had some really bad ones. And then the subcontractors, they can also put a lien on your home. So can you just go a little bit more deeply into that so people understand?
Yeah. So to clarify, like a lien on your home is where someone basically says, you owe me money, and I have some kind of document to back up that you owe me money. And so I am going to basically put that debt on your home, on the title of your home. And so it is kind of bad for your credit, like it shows up as a public record. But B, it means you can't really do anything with that home then, right? Like you can't sell it without paying off the lien. You can't refinance it without paying off the lien. Like there's all kinds of things that you can't do. And it really does sort of handcuff people, especially when they're recovering, because that access to credit is so critical to recovery. But absolutely, it is, anybody that touches your home in recovery has the opportunity to put a lien on your home. They are difficult to fight. We encourage people to work with, to at first give a call and see if it was an accident, because that does happen sometimes where someone will say, oh my gosh, you're right, you did pay that. We'll go ahead and get rid of it. But a lot of folks do end up working with legal aid to get those removed. And it is a long and difficult process. Unfortunately, the best way to guard against it is to read in great detail through those contractor contracts and make sure that, it isn't money for getting materials, for instance, in the kind of fraud the scam we were talking about before. It is money that pays for the materials.
Oh, that is such a good tip. I would not have thought about that they would charge you for getting materials, not paying for materials. Oh.
And it's really little things like that, right? Where, everything seems to be going right? You're taking the right step. It feels like you're going forward, and then suddenly something can kind of come out of nowhere and pull you backwards.
How often do you see, because this was a big problem here, when people are panicked right after the disaster, and the first impulse is really just to get back what you had before. I hear that over and over and over again, and I'm always like, I'm sorry, it's the day before is actually gone, and it's worth grieving over, and take the time to grieve and the space to do it. But your life and what it looked like and how you walked through it is not the same. Doesn't mean it's going to be terrible. It just means it's not going to be the same, and you can't get back. But in that a very human urge to get back, what we saw and I've seen many times is that, in California, you can only give the contractor $1,000 up front. That's the law. And so, but people were writing checks for 100,000, 50,000, 150,000 because they wanted to get to the front of the line. So they broke the law. They didn't, they broke the law in a space of trauma. And then the contractors accepted it, knowing that the person in front of them was in trauma and knowing what the law was. And a lot of them just took off with the money. And there was, that was it, done.
Yeah. Yeah. And, one of the things we caution people against, so first, making sure that people know what the laws are in their area, absolutely critical, right? Especially when it comes to anyone that you're going to pay or anyone who's helping you get money, right? Because we do see kind of aid scams too, where someone's going to help you apply for FEMA or help you apply for SBA, and really they're stealing benefits, right?
Who are those people though that are who show up and say, I'm going to help you do that?
Frankly, people who are heartless if they're you. But anybody that's charging you for an inspection, anyone who's charging you for, if FEMA comes in and says they're from FEMA and they're trying to get you to pay money so that they can look at your home, that's also a scam.
So in the space of fraud, and so sometimes you see people who will show up and pretend to be FEMA, but they're asking to inspect your home. Now in wildfire, we don't have anything left to inspect, but I'm wondering, like, how do they show up as a disaster navigator, or what are they doing? Like, how do they disguise that?
So they'll come up and they'll say, I'm from FEMA, right? And I'm here because you put in an application for FEMA, and so I just need to see the damage before we can write you the check. They'll do the same thing. They'll say, I'm here from your insurance company, and I'm just here to check the damage, but first we need that payment for the inspection, and the inspection's $1,000, right? And typically they want it in cash right then. Anybody who's coming from your insurance, anybody who's coming from FEMA or from SBA, like, they're always going to have credentials with them, real credentials. And if anything kind of makes you wonder, if anything kind of doesn't quite feel right, SBA, FEMA, Red Cross, other nonprofits that are in the area, like, all of them will feel very good about you calling their kind of national number and checking to make sure they're real, right? Like,
they want you to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So if somebody says, you you can't, or you shouldn't, or I'm going to have to leave and come back later if you try and check out who I am. Then talking, right?
Mm-hmm.
So those are kind of the other really common scams that we see.
I can't, I never understand how people do those things, but that's fine. Okay, so I've just undergone a disaster, and you've kind of helped me through that first initial, rush of FEMA and SBA and navigating that. And then also to sort of understand, for a lot of people, they are very surprised, the intricacies of FEMA. And if you got an individual assistance declaration or not, because it doesn't apply to all counties, dependent upon the county wealth, not the wealth of the individual, something we would like to see changed. So tell us, what do you see most often 6 months, 1 year, 2 years post disaster?
Yeah, so I think this is where we start to see real differences based on the type of disaster that it is, right? So recovery from a tornado, for instance, can begin almost immediately, next day, right? You're able to begin clearing things. You're pretty quickly able to begin rebuilding. Something like a fire, on the other hand, really sort of the complete other end of the spectrum. That's one where there's often, a year or more before you can, individuals can get back in there and start clearing the land and start thinking about rebuilding. And so those differences really, really are important. But I think the thing that's common in all of the disasters that we work with is you've got that initial period after disaster when you've got, Red Cross and FEMA and SBA and, Cajun Navy and all these nonprofit groups that are genuinely there to help and kind of injecting aid into the community. And then they go away. That period ends, and you sort of the entire area transitions into kind of more long-term recovery. And even though, after a disaster, you hear about headlines and things in the news about Congress often allocating funds for a disaster, right? That money doesn't get into the community right away. That usually gets into the community 1 to 2 years later.
Or 5 years. In the case of HUD, it can easily be 5 years. It can be 7 years. It can be for the block grants that go to cities and counties, entities, just to be clear. Yeah, go ahead.
So that period of time where there's sort of not new aid coming into the area, that's when we're working with consumers to make as much financial space in their budget as we can to help them recover. And so sometimes that is helping them find other nonprofits that are still active in the area. Sometimes that's working with their creditors, right? Their mortgage company, their credit card companies, their bank, right? To get some payment relief. Or to, ask for assistance directly, and lots of creditors will provide it. So we mentioned Fannie Mae at the top of the show. Fannie Mae borrowers, for instance, can go into disaster forbearance where they won't have to make a payment for a period of time while they're recovering.
So you've been working with Fannie Mae for years, as have I. Love working with them. It's the most impactful partnership I've ever had. Can you tell me how your role with Fannie Mae plays into the disaster space? How can people find out about that?
Absolutely. So you can go to Fannie Mae's website, fanniemae.com, and then click Here to Help, and you'll be able to see all of Fannie Mae's counseling resources. You'll be able to find your servicer information, so you can call your servicer. But I have to say, Fannie Mae does a lot to really support folks who are going through disasters. And so I encourage people to check it out.
And one of the things that I really love is, when they put together a disaster team in 2017, actually, right during our fires is when they really were starting to put it together, but they were boots on the ground for us 3 months later. They were kind of way ahead of the curve from a lot of other organizations, and I super appreciate that. To be clear, you can go to their website and find out who owns your mortgage, because you know who your lender is, but your lender is not necessarily who owns your mortgage. It could very well be Fannie Mae. If it is, then you have the opportunity to do a 1-year forbearance. And instead of charging you interest or a balloon payment, they just add that year to the end of your mortgage. So if it was a 30-year mortgage, it's now a 31-year mortgage. So it gives you really a huge huge breathing space. And when I tell disaster communities this, that they have this opportunity, so many have said, oh my God, I did not know at all. And I was trying to figure out, how am I going to pay a mortgage while I pay a rent, while I rebuild a home? Do you know? So I really love that you're a part of that network.
Thank you. Fannie is a great partner, just a phenomenal partner out there.
Really compassionate.
Very compassionate. They genuinely care.
They do. They're on the ground. I'm traveling to the Marshall Fire with them later this month, and I'm a lot of traveling with them. So it's more than just like, because they don't just call it in. They actually they get on the ground, they meet people, they listen to their concerns, they talk about mortgages, they talk about renters. Can you actually, that's a great segue. Can you talk to us about your experience with the impact of disaster on renters?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of things. So first, when someone is renting, right, and they're in, say like a multifamily rental unit, right? So there's several units in a single building. One of the real challenges that I think most renters don't realize is if one of those units is severely damaged, the landlord may have to basically kick out everyone in the building because of health and safety challenges, right? So even if it doesn't damage your particular unit, your apartment, your condo, you still might end up having to leave your rental because of the damage from the storm or the fire, or whatever the event was. I think the other thing that people can be surprised by is that renters really need to have insurance. The insurance that the landlord has on the building, even if you're renting from like just an individual, right? If you're renting a house from an individual, their homeowner's insurance on that property does not cover your things or your loss or anything, right? So renters should try and get, if you can find a way to afford it, get renter's insurance. It makes a big difference after
it's very inexpensive though too. Even if all you can afford is a basic policy, even if all you're going to get out of it is $10,000 or something, that's like $10,000 you don't have to find, and it can be as low as $5 or $10 a month. So you definitely, it's a must-have. I don't like over-regulating, but I do wish that were a requirement for renters in a climate we're unstable or climate-based disaster area, which is really all of us. So, because it's very sad when they just don't know that they're not covered. It's like getting into somebody else's car and you're driving along and you get into a car accident and you think, well, their insurance is going to cover me. And then you find out that you were supposed to carry your own insurance, because insurance just doesn't work the same for all parts. So I appreciate that. So, and what do you see like 3 years after disaster?
Yeah. So I think it's actually a really good segue from renters to 3 years. So one of the things we see common across all disasters is disaster puts incredible pressure on the housing stock in an area, right? So there were 1,000 homes in an area and 1,000 families, for instance. 500 are damaged. Suddenly you have only 500 units, but you still have 1,000 families in the area who need a home. And so that pressure usually comes with rapidly increasing housing costs. And it happens in the area where the disaster occurs and continues out into the surrounding cities and towns a good distance. So one of the big challenges that we work with folks on is finding ways to afford that new payment. And sometimes insurance companies will help pick up that cost or help pick up a portion of that cost for different time periods. That varies pretty wildly from state to state. But regardless, people have to find a way to sort of adjust to that new cost. Similarly with jobs, right? Like the jobs that, when a disaster occurs, jobs disappear in that area too, or the jobs that are in that area really change because the needs of the community change so quickly. And so it can be difficult to find new employment. And often we see people end up taking pay cuts for a few years so that they can stay in the area. But the job that they had just no longer pays as much for some time. And so helping people adjust to that new financial reality is really critical, and helping them adjust really quickly. Because the longer someone goes where they're spending more than they're making every month, right, the more challenged, the harder it is for them to recover long term, right? Typically they use their credit cards for that. And so that becomes a challenge as well. We hit like the 3-year mark in general for folks who are rebuilding. usually at that point in most, though certainly not all disasters, that congressional aid money has come through, right? And so you'll hear people talk about um, CDBGDR funds, or they're block grants, basically, where Congress allocates the money. HUD is the one who helps kind of disperse the money to the different areas. And then each community gets to decide kind of, here are the ways that we are going to spend this money in order to make recoveries happen. And very frequently those include aid to consumers, right? But there's usually some kind of strings and requirements for it. And so we help folks understand what those terms are, find those kinds of programs. They're often grants, make those applications and get them through, but also help people prepare for it in kind of that interim period, right? So very frequently we see reimbursement for repairs and rebuilding and certain kinds of material. And so we'll help people ahead of time as they're working with this recovering to make sure that they're keeping receipts, that they, have those organized, that they know kind of what things are typically covered in those programs, what typically isn't. And then as soon as those programs open up, if they do in their area, letting them know, like, hey, you can go get $10,000 back for septic tank repairs, that kind of thing, whatever it is.
And then you help them when they are denied, because again, it's a public funds issue. Yep. It is meant to do to take good care of public funds, and to remember that SBA doesn't set the policies. That's actually not them. They are trying, and it's a very difficult space to prevent fraud. And so sometimes preventing fraud prevents access for everyone, and so you have to just keep going back and appeal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing, because we've talked about SBA a little bit, that's so important, right? Even though it's a loan, it is so important for everyone to apply for SBA if SBA is offered in your area, even if you don't intend to take it, right? Even if you don't want that loan, you don't think it's for you, even if you don't think you'll qualify, it's still really important to take it, because that opens up other potential benefits in your area that you wouldn't otherwise have access to if you didn't apply.
Like what? Can you be specific? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so there's some benefits that FEMA, it's easier to get certain benefits from FEMA if you have applied to SBA. Some nonprofits are then able to provide money in a way that is really materially different when SBA has been denied. But if you don't apply, all of those doors are closed, and it's I think incredibly confusing, because it is the Small Business Administration, right? So it's not obvious to people what their role is going to be. And then applying for a loan feels like it's something that you intend to accept and that you expect to receive. And so telling people, even though we know, your credit score, your income just are not going to support a loan, we just need you to apply for it, because then this next thing is going to get easier.
And I think that just speaks to, once again, why it's so important to have navigators in this field. Like, I'm sort of a generalist for communities. I can go like that, go to that, this, but to have like people like you who are so very specific, who really understand the different corners of it and can walk people through, because it's not instinctual how it works. It doesn't work like anything else. And even with FEMA, you may have a case manager. That case manager may not be funded really though until a year post disaster. That's very common, and you can really help fill that space, because there's quite a big gap of very important decisions that people make between day 1 post disaster and day 365, when case managers may be assigned. Case managers are often though only used by a certain segment of the population, and even more commonly, they are not experienced, because they're from the community that also was affected by the disaster. They're not really necessarily experienced in navigating FEMA, and it's a surprise to them that the things that it's a bit of a game of fish. You have to know what to ask for, and then FEMA wants to give it to you, but it's not as obvious. Every community is assigned a FEMA. It's called a VAL, and they actually will help. They help the case managers and the public officials and everybody sort of navigate. But you can have that person rotate too. Sometimes we see 4 in the first, year, easy. And in our case, it's often their very first wildfire. So everyone is doing their best on the learning curve, but this is the thing about disaster that can be both exhilarating in that there's a lot of room for leadership and emergent leaders and people who want to step up into their community, and we should not be gatekeeping that. We should be really like encouraging that. But learning it over and reinventing the wheel over and over again is one of the things that there are many of us in this space that don't want people to do, because it just the suffering that you incur trying to go through a trauma and then learn how to navigate this space of disaster that does not work like anything else that you've ever encountered before. So
yeah,
that's my soapbox. Yeah.
Yeah. I will say, if you're a nonprofit or even a for-profit organization that's trying to help out after a disaster, FEMA vals are incredible resources. So even if they haven't recovered from that particular type of disaster, a big part of their job is helping connect different parts of the community to each other. And so meet with them if you can, try to build a good relationship with them, even though, there can be that churn as somebody else is assigned or reassigned, right? But they are, again, like you said, a group that really wants to help out.
Yes.
And worth forging a relationship with.
They're even good they're great for me too, because sometimes I'll get like a supervisor in a community that will call and ask me a question and be like, I'm not sure why we're not getting this. And I'm like, now I know more questions to ask. I'm like, well, did you ask for this specifically? Did you put it in an email? Did you put it on letterhead? But I've had great experiences just saying, okay, can you give me the number for your FEMA val? Because often people, even in positions of power, are afraid to ask questions that make them look like they may not know what they're talking about, because they don't want to be denied on the basis of that, or they're not sure what the power structure is. And the FEMA val could assure them over and over again that they're really there to help, but there still can be a fear factor for any kind of pushback, any kind of like asking again. And because I am in the space, I don't have to have that fear factor, because I can call and just ask the question. And I know I've dealt with enough vals that I know that they're there for absolutely the right reasons. And they're happy to do that. And they don't mind the pushback. And they usually give me the answer, and then I translate it back. But yeah, so that, so what have we not covered that I should have asked about? We have about, I see 9 minutes left, and I just want to make sure that I'm sure you have a list of stuff that I have not even thought to ask.
Yeah, I think there's sort of two things I would love to kind of put in. One is, one of the things that I think we do really well with Project Porchlight is when long-term disaster case management groups pop up in an area, we are good at helping people work with those groups. We want them to work with those groups. Consumers get basically a written action plan after every interaction with us. And we're encouraging them to share those with their long-term disaster case managers. Project Porchlight is a spoke in the wheel for their recovery. But really, again, our main focus is financial, and there is so much more to the recovery than that. And so helping people connect with those groups it has been incredibly helpful. The other thing I'd love to talk a little bit about are some of our long-term outcomes with Project Porchlight. So what we found is without some kind of support in place, right? Your typical consumer who goes through a disaster ends up losing about 25 points on their credit score in that first year. And their credit continues to go down over the next couple of years. It is financially devastating. Because not only is it financially devastating kind of in that moment and all that people are spending to try and recover, but not having your credit score fall means that the cost of borrowing goes up, as does things like the cost of insurance, and it can be harder to get a job if your credit score isn't higher. And so with Project Porchlight, what we found is that in that first year, we're able to prevent people from losing any ground on their credit score. Awesome.
So the other thing you really wanted to talk about is
credit and kind of the outcomes of Project Porchlight. So what we know is that after a disaster, the average consumer's credit score falls about 25 points in that first year. It is financially devastating, not just kind of in all of the money that people are spending in an attempt to recover, but also because lower credit scores mean things cost more, right? It costs more to borrow. You're less likely to get the ideal loan. You're more likely to get a loan that has not as great a terms.
It's very expensive to be poor. It's just very, very expensive. Yeah.
Incredibly expensive, especially to have bad credit. But so, what we found is that working with a counselor from Project Porchlight, we're able to prevent people from losing ground on average in that first year. And over the following 3 years, people gain about 30 points on their credit score on average. And so not only, like I said, are they not losing ground, but they're actually gaining ground in that area.
That's very impressive. If I can just say, like, that's very, very impressive.
We are incredibly proud. And I will say, it is sometimes tough to explain to people that no change to a credit score is a huge win, but effectively that's a 25-point increase, right? Like, you have prevented a 25-point fall in their credit. So it's something we're very proud of. Consumers that work with us are less likely to, feel as financially stressed. They're more likely to be able to return to kind of making regular payments again and having kind of a more financial normal within about 12 months of working with their counselor. But I will say, our counselors will work with someone for as long as they need. So I think our longest consumer has been with us for about 18 months, but we will continue to follow up, to check in, to stick with that person, for as long as they feel like they need us. And people can always come back. So if someone feels like they got what they need from their counselor, they say, we don't need to keep having these conversations. I think I can do it. And then they run into a new financial roadblock. People can always come back and call their counselor again, and we can start back up and find ways to get around that roadblock. But I'm really proud of what we've been able to achieve, and how many people we've been able to help with Project Porchlight.
I totally, I think I'm just very happy that you exist. And also, there's a lot of people in the disaster space aren't really, they want to help later, but it's very hard with funding, with long-term recovery, anything. It's very hard because the donations dry up, and to have partners like Fannie Mae or people who will stay in it for the very long term is something that I hope that we see more and more often, especially with our increased disasters that we're having in this country and globally too. And so I really applaud the fact that you were even way ahead of sort of the this huge climate crisis thing that we're experiencing now, that you already had all of your systems in place to take care of people. I love that.
Thank you.
So, excuse me. So one of the last things I'd like to ask you about, which I ask just about everybody in this field, is can be very stressful. The helpers are the last ones to ask for help. We absorb a lot of trauma and pain. And we're not superheroes or saviors. We're just human beings. And so how is it that you manage to stay in this work for so long and to take care of yourself and have some balance there?
Yeah, so I think kind of we've got two sides of it. So, like, personally, me, it is about really trying to focus on the successes and trying to think of setbacks and kind of some of the emotional grind as learning opportunities, but also giving myself the opportunity to say, today, this is all I can do. This has been enough. And I need to step back and do something that cares for me. I'd say when I first started doing this work, that was not a skill that I had. I'd sharpened. It took a long time for me to get there and say, you know what, if I don't give myself a pause and give myself a step back today, then I'm not going to be able to be here tomorrow for it, right? But also, like I said, focusing on the positives. We have, I think at MMI, that is something we're very good at. We keep client success stories online. We also share client success stories with our counselors. And when I feel down, when I feel like we're not making a difference, I can go back and read those success stories. And that's another, it's a way to tangibly feel how much of an impact it makes. For our counselors, having a really strong EAP program makes a huge difference. So we know that the folks doing this work, talking to every client day after day, right, that can be incredibly overwhelming. And this is what they do full time, right? There's enough disasters that we are never standing down. We are always active. So having a really strong EAP program is important. We have a great education team that takes education very seriously beyond just sort of the things about our job. And so we've got a desk yoga kind of series where people can take a break and do kind of this guided yoga at their desk that sort of helps them tune back into themselves. Counselors can always go to their manager and say, you know what, hey, I can't do my next call like this. I cannot take another new call today. I need to have a minute just to be quiet in myself, right? Or or to step back. And so our managers know that that's a thing that the counselors need, and so they're able to provide it. But again, really trying to focus on the big successes, I think is critical.
It is critical. And it's interesting because I've been in one nonprofit and then one emergency operations center that each had a crying room. They had set aside rooms for people to go in and cry. And that's, I was like, well, that's very good. I'm not mad about that at all. But also that says a lot about what we're doing here, which can be a little much. People ask me all the time, like, isn't that just so depressing when you go to a wildfire community and like everything is destroyed and you see the same thing over and over again, and the pain and the suffering? And I'm like, I don't, I'm sad for them, but I'm there to help them, and they don't need me to be crying all over them. But I can see why people have a crying room in offices. So I'm not saying don't have that. I'm saying is like, you have to have strategies though, for when you walk in or you're helping somebody, that you may absorb it. It may take me like 2 weeks actually afterwards to sort of reconcile it in my heart. But the people that you meet though, and the impact and the possibility to lessen human suffering is what sort of draws us all into this space and to do our lane and do our share. And I'm just so pleased that you are in a space that's not that populated. I am glad to see, I just interviewed SBP has a new program where they're helping people with individual assistance, and it's just getting off the ground. They've had some successes, which is good, with FEMA appeals. But honestly, like I wish you had more competition. I mean, you could still like take over, but I do wish you had more competition, because there's only, so much of you to go around. So can you, we will put links below, but if you want to say what your website is for MMI or Project Porchlight on this broadcast, I'd love for you to do that.
Thank you so much. So if you go to moneymanagement.org, that is our MMI website, and at the top you can click on disaster and connect with a disaster counselor.
And again, it is a nonprofit. So if anyone is out there thinking that they really love and want to support this work, you can also go to the same website and support their work directly. Long-term recovery is an unfunded or underfunded space. And it's just incredibly important, the impact that you have on people when they really feel like the whole world has moved on, because it has, but their lives are still completely like upended and not put back together the same. So anything you can do to help. And I just really want to thank you, Kate, for the work that you do and for coming on the How to Disaster podcast.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. This has been wonderful.
I'm so glad. This is the coolest thing about this part of the job, is that I get to introduce people to cool people that I've met along the way. And so thank you so much. And once again, this has been the How to Disaster podcast. Thanks for spending this time with us. And that's a wrap. Thank you for joining us on the podcast, How to Disaster. For more information, please visit our website at afterthefireusa.org. And if you liked this video, please hit subscribe.